What we see playing out right now in the US economy only happens during recessions. I'm going to explain this to you in one simple, fast step. Let's start by going over the most accurate indicator of economic output. Is that GDP? No, it's actually GDI, gross domestic income. Let's look at a chart going all the way back to 2000 to today's date. On the left, we go from, 0 up to 15% and then down to negative 10%. And we can see that pretty much every single time we go into a recession, and this chart goes back even further than 2000, GDI, as you would expect, goes negative. And what's highly unusual is right now, editor, you can go ahead and throw up the chart, we have a huge divergence between GDI and GDP, which you would assume would have almost a one-to-one correlation. More on that in just a moment. Now, I know a lot of you are watching this video right now and saying, okay, George, what you're doing is you're just kind of cherry picking the data, and we know from watching your videos that you think your base case is there's going to be a recession in 2024. You think the yield curve is actually accurate just because it's been accurate pretty much every single time going back to 1950. So you are biased. But no, don't take my word on it. Take the word of none other than the Federal Reserve themselves. Editor, let's cut to the internet. Let's go straight to the website of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. This is a post from March 21st, 2016, titled, "What is the better measurement of economic output, GDP or GDI?" And again, this is not George Gammon talking. This is straight from the Federal Reserve themselves. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA, produces two measures of national output, which in theory should be equivalent. In practice, however, there are often substantive differences. The first measure of output produced by the BEA, obviously GDP, everyone knows this. GDP is defined as the value of final goods and services and is measured on the production side. The second measure of output produced by the BEA is gross domestic income and is measured by summing of wages, profits, interest payments, and investments. In principle, these two series measure the exact same object. Indeed, the figure below shows that the two series have very similar dynamics. The blue line plots the percentage change in GDI from 1980 to the present. Red line shows the percentage change in GDP for the same period. And I would like to point out that this chart goes back a lot further than 1980. It's just the segment that they're referencing in this article. And when you go back to, let's just call it the late 1940s, you see that GDI is a very, very accurate indicator of recession. But here's where it gets interesting. Federal Reserve economist Jeremy Nowak explored the differences between GDP and GDI in greater detail. He argued that GDI might be a better, I repeat, better indicator, as advanced estimates of GDI are closer to the final estimates of both measures. So let me let's go through this to make sure that we're all on the same page. What this Federal Reserve economist is saying is that when you compare GDI to GDP in real time, GDI is almost always a better predictor of the revised numbers for both GDI and GDP in the future. So why are we even looking at GDP when we should just be focusing on GDI? Because there's a very high probability that when we look back on this time in a year, 2, 3 years, we're going to say to ourselves, oh yeah, GDI was right, GDP was wrong. Getting back to the post, Nowak evaluated GDP and GDI by comparing vintages of the unrevised data. Very, very important there. The unrevised data to show that early estimates of GDI captured the downturn in the 2007 to 2009 recession better than GDP, which could have given policymakers advance notice. So when it comes to the measurement that you should be paying most attention to, don't listen to George Gammon. Listen to the Federal Reserve themselves. And what's ironic is GDI is a measurement that the mainstream media, the talking heads, the quote-unquote experts out there, never acknowledge. They just kind of sweep it under the rug and focus on GDP. Lastly, what I'd like to point out, going back to the chart that compares real GDP with real GDI, is the only time we have had a huge discrepancy going all the way back to the late 1940s between the two measurements of output was oddly the GFC. And if you zoom in, you'll notice that there's an even bigger discrepancy today than there was prior to the global financial crisis. But it's not just the GDI that's screaming recession right now. It's also something called the LEI. Now, most of the headlines or the metrics that you see in the mainstream media, they're all looking in the rearview mirror. They're all what we call lagging indicators. But there's a lot of leading indicators that we have in economics. Particularly, there's an entity called the Conference Board that aggregates a lot of this data and puts it into an index. The 10 components of the Conference Board Leading Economic Index for the U.S. include average weekly hours in manufacturing, average weekly initial claims for unemployment insurance, manufacturers' new orders for consumer goods and materials, ISM index of new orders, manufacturers' new orders for non-defense capital goods, excluding aircraft orders, building permits, and new private housing units, S&P 500 index of stock prices, leading credit index, interest rate spread, 10-year Treasury bonds less Fed funds rate, in other words, inversion of the curve, average consumer expectations for business conditions. So you see that this is a very complete index, to say the least. And historically, they've found that these metrics are actually leading indicators where, like we said before, what you see in the mainstream media are almost all lagging indicators. And editor, go ahead and throw up a chart, and we can see that just like GDI, the LEI gives us an indication of recession long before we get it from GDP alone. And I'd also like to point out that we have never been where we are today at negative 8% and not been in a recession already. And this next chart lays it out for us perfectly. According to the Conference Board, this red line is a recession signal, where the black line is merely a recession warning. And right now, in 2023, we are way south of the red line, meaning we're far, far below what would indicate a recession signal. Oh, but wait, there is more. In past videos, we've talked about how the Fed's mysterious beige book is also insinuating that we could be in a recession right now. So what is the beige book? It's actually an aggregation of all of these reports or surveys that the regional Federal Reserve banks do at a local level. So they go out and survey business owners, they say, how's it going, and a lot of different data points. And then they give a summary that is included in this mysterious beige book. And if you read the latest beige book, you see that pretty much every one of the regional reserve banks are saying, hey, as far as the employment numbers, as far as economic activity, we see it slowing down significantly. I would argue all the things that we've discussed in this video so far contributed to Jerome Powell doing that epic pivot the other day, where he went from being very, very hawkish to all of a sudden extremely dovish, indicating that the Federal Reserve themselves will likely start to drop rates moving into 2024. Now, I know a lot of you right about now are saying, George, I get what you're saying with the data, but it just doesn't make sense. I mean, I turn on the mainstream media, I listen to the central planners and the authoritarians, and they're telling me that the economy is doing fine and there's nothing to worry about. We don't even have to worry about a soft landing. We're going to have no landing because the central planners are so clever that we've avoided it altogether, and this time the yield curve is incorrect. In other words, this time it's different. Okay, fair enough, but I'd like to point out that every single person that's saying that is looking at the NBER, or National Bureau of Economic Research. That's the entity that officially says we were in a recession from this time to this time. But notice I said we were in a recession. You see, the NBER never comes out and announces that we're in a recession right now. They always do this looking in the rearview mirror. Let me give you an example. They announced that we officially went into recession, and let's call it December of 2007 or January of 2008. But they didn't even make this announcement until December of 2008. And oh, by the way, if you go to their website, I'd like to point out that the two measurements that they give that are the most accurate to determine when a recession started is GDP and, you guessed it, GDI. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here. I will see you on the next video.